The doors of St. Michael's Trauma Center burst open at 10:47 p.m., and the night shift charge nurse, Kate Bennett, didn't need anyone to tell her this was going to be bad. 6 men in torn tactical gear stormed through the ambulance bay carrying a seventh on a makeshift litter. His chest a ruin of blood-soaked gauze, his face pale as chalk under the fluorescent lights. The lead man, a broad-shouldered soldier with a jaw clenched tight enough to crack, was shouting orders that nobody in the hospital had the authority to give, but nobody argued with him either. Kate didn't wait for a doctor. She didn't wait for permission. She simply moved, the way she had moved 1,000 times before, cutting through the chaos with the calm of someone who had seen worse than this and lived to tell no one about it. "Trauma 3 now," she said, and her voice cut through the noise like a blade through fabric. The team scrambled. The dying man was wheeled in, and Kate was already pulling on gloves before the gurney stopped rolling. His name, according to the tag still clipped to his vest, was Ranger Staff Sergeant Daniel Cole. His unit had pulled him out of what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission gone catastrophically wrong, a firefight in hostile terrain that left 3 of his brothers dead and Cole with a chest wound that had already taken him past the point most trauma surgeons would call salvageable. But Kate wasn't most trauma surgeons. She wasn't a surgeon at all, technically, but in the 90 seconds it took for the attending physician to arrive, she had already stopped the worst of the bleeding, established an airway, and called out vitals with a precision that made the incoming doctor pause at the door. "Who trained her?" he murmured to himself, watching her hands move with a speed and certainty that belonged in a field hospital, not a civilian or. He didn't know it yet, but that question would become the center of everything that followed. Outside the trauma bay, the 6 surviving Rangers stood in a tight, grim cluster, blood and dirt streaked across their faces, weapons secured but eyes never still. These were men who did not do helplessness well. They had spent years learning to control every variable in a firefight, and now they stood powerless behind a pane of reinforced glass, watching a stranger in blue scrubs fight for their brother's life with nothing but her hands and her instincts. The team's second in command, a grizzled operator named Marcus Reyes, pressed his palm flat against the glass, his gaze locked on the nurse's movements. He'd seen combat medics work under fire in 3 different countries, and something about the way this woman moved struck a chord he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just skill. It was familiarity, the kind of muscle memory that came from doing something under conditions where a wasted second meant a body bag. Then Reyes saw it. As Kate reached up to adjust the overhead light, her sleeve rode up just enough to reveal the inside of her left wrist. Black ink faded at the edges but unmistakable even through the glass. A small skull wrapped in a wreath of laurel leaves, a design so specific, so deliberately obscure, that only a handful of people on Earth would recognize it for what it was. Reyes felt the air leave his lungs. He grabbed the arm of the man beside him, a younger operator named Tommy Hale, and pointed with a trembling finger. "Tell me I'm not losing my mind," he whispered. Hale followed his gaze, squinted through the glass and went white. "That's a ghost company mark," he said, his voice barely audible over the beeping monitors. "That's not a nurse. That's one of ours." The words rippled through the small group like an electric current. Ghost Company was not a name spoken casually, not even among Rangers who had earned the right to know such things existed. It was a designation whispered about in classified briefings. A black operations unit so deeply buried in the architecture of military secrecy that most soldiers went their entire careers without ever confirming it was real. The tattoo was not decoration. It was a brand, given only to those who had completed the kind of missions that never appeared in after-action reports, missions that were erased from history the moment they concluded. And the men staring through that glass now understood, with a cold certainty settling into their bones, that the woman keeping their brother alive had once lived a life defined by exactly the kind of controlled, ruthless efficiency they were witnessing in real time. Inside the trauma bay, oblivious to the storm of recognition happening just beyond the glass, Kate Bennett fought on. Cole's blood pressure was crashing, his pulse thready and irregular, and the machines around him were screaming warnings that would have sent a lesser clinician into a panic. Kate didn't panic. She called for a chest tube, her hands steady even as sweat beaded along her hairline, and when the resident hesitated for half a second too long, she took the instrument herself and made the incision with a precision that silenced the room. Blood and air hissed free from the pleural space, and Cole's oxygen levels began, slowly, agonizingly, to climb back towards something survivable. "Come on," Kate murmured under her breath, a phrase that sounded less like a nurse's encouragement and more like an order given to a soldier who had no business quitting on her watch. "Not tonight. You don't get to die on my table tonight." For nearly 40 minutes, Kate Bennett waged a private war against death itself, and death, for once, lost ground. When Cole's vitals finally stabilized enough to move him to surgery, Kate stepped back from the table, her scrubs soaked through, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. She peeled off her bloodied gloves and looked up, meeting the eyes of 6 exhausted, grief-stricken soldiers through the glass, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with hospital protocol. Marcus Reyes stared at her wrist one more time, at that small black skull that had no business existing on the arm of a civilian trauma nurse, and he understood with absolute certainty that this night was about to become something none of them had expected, because whoever Kate Bennett had been before she picked up a stethoscope, she had not simply walked away from that life. And now, 6 men who had trusted their lives to secrecy and silence were about to demand answers from the one person in the building who understood exactly why those answers mattered. If this story already has your heart pounding, imagine what happens when Kate finally has to explain that tattoo. Hit subscribe right now so you don't miss the moment the truth comes out, because Chapter 2 is where everything changes. 2 hours later, Ranger Cole was out of surgery and listed in stable but critical condition, and the adrenaline that had carried Kate Bennett through the worst of the crisis finally began to drain from her body, leaving behind an exhaustion so deep it felt like gravity had doubled. She retreated to the small break room behind the nurse's station, intending to steal 5 quiet minutes with a lukewarm cup of coffee, but the door opened before she'd even sat down. Marcus Reyes stood in the frame, still in his blood-streaked gear, his expression unreadable in the way that only men trained to give nothing away could manage. Behind him, the rest of his team filled the narrow hallway, silent, watchful, waiting. Kate felt the shift in the air immediately, the particular stillness of people who were no longer simply grateful strangers. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, keeping her voice level, though something in her chest had already tightened in recognition of what was coming. Reyes didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes dropped deliberately to her left wrist, to the sleeve she had rolled back to scrub in for surgery and never bothered to roll back down. Kate followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. She hadn't thought about that tattoo in years, not really, not as anything other than old scar tissue from a life she'd buried under night shifts and trauma protocols and the deliberate, exhausting work of becoming someone new. "Ghost Company," Reyes said quietly, and the 2 words landed in the small room like a detonation. "4th Battalion. 2015 through 2019, if I had to guess, based on the wreath style." "Am I close?" Kate's hand instinctively moved to cover the mark, an old reflex from a life where that gesture could mean the difference between an operation succeeding and an operation being blown wide open. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice betrayed her, a half-second too slow, a half-degree too controlled. Tommy Hale stepped forward, his young face a mixture of awe and disbelief. "You worked with First Sergeant Alvarez," he said, not a question. "You had to. That mark only went to operators who ran with him directly, and there weren't more than a dozen of you ever in the entire program." Kate closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the walls she had built over years of careful reinvention beginning to crack under the weight of men who simply refused to be lied to. When she opened them again, something in her posture had changed, straightened, the way a soldier stands when there is no longer any point pretending to be anything other than what they are. 6 years, she said finally, her voice quiet but no longer hesitant. 6 years running operations that never had names, extracting people who officially never existed, in places that officially we were never in. I was the medic. I kept people alive in conditions that would make tonight look like a walk in the park. And then I came home, and I decided that the next chapter of my life was going to be about saving people in the light, not in the dark. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant hum of hospital machinery beyond the door. Reyes studied her for a long moment, and something in his hardened expression softened, just slightly, into something closer to respect than suspicion. "That's why you moved like that in there," he said. "That's why you didn't flinch when his pressure crashed. That's why you took that chest tube out of the resident's hands instead of waiting for someone with a fancier title to catch up." Kate allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first genuine one of the night. In the field, hesitation gets people killed, she said. I never stopped believing that, even after I traded a rifle for a stethoscope. Cole is alive right now because somebody in that room understood there wasn't time to wait for permission. Hale shook his head slowly, disbelief giving way to something like reverence. We thought we lost him on the chopper, he admitted. Command told us the odds were basically zero. And then we get here, and some ER nurse just decides those odds don't apply to her operating room. Reyes crossed the small space and extended his hand, an old gesture between operators, simple and absolute. On behalf of my team and on behalf of a brother who's alive because of you tonight, thank you, he said. Whatever name you go by now, whatever life you've built, you didn't lose what made you one of the best medics that program ever produced. Kate shook his hand, and for the first time in years she let herself feel the full weight of the life she had once lived without flinching away from it, without trying to bury it under new titles and new routines. I didn't lose it, she said. I just decided it belonged to more people than the ones we used to serve in the dark. Tonight it belonged to Cole. Tomorrow, it'll belong to whoever comes through those doors next. The soldiers exchanged glances and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that they had stumbled, entirely by accident, into the presence of someone who represented exactly what their entire brotherhood was built to protect. The idea that some people never stop serving, they simply changed the battlefield. 3 days later, Ranger Cole opened his eyes for the first time since the mission that nearly killed him, and the first face he saw, blurry and exhausted but unmistakably present, belonged to the nurse who had refused to let him die on her table. He wouldn't learn the full story of her past for weeks, not until Reyes finally told him quietly, in the hallway outside his recovery room, about the tattoo and the silence and the 6 years neither of them would ever be allowed to discuss in detail. But Cole would remember for the rest of his life, the sensation of being pulled back from the edge by hands that knew exactly what they were doing, hands that had done this exact impossible work before, in places far darker than a hospital trauma bay. And Kate Bennett would go back to her next shift, back to her ordinary nurse's badge and her ordinary scrubs, carrying a secret that 6 grateful men now shared with her. Understanding that some heroes never stop fighting, they simply change the uniform they fight in. This is exactly the kind of story that deserves to be shared, so if it moved you even a little, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like Kate's are exactly what this channel is built to tell, and you will not want to miss what we bring you next.